Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, I don't know if this has been very obvious to you, if you all have gotten the memo on this or not, but one of the great pet peeves of our research staff here at the Peoples and Things is navel-gazing scholarship. We, if nothing else, are champions of looking past your own shit. And a good deal of scholarship is vulnerable to this bias, being hung up on ourselves. And let's face it, ourselves is a safe, easy, comfortable place to be. It's a place to start, but hopefully we pull out of it as a project develops. Still, so many narratives about technology can ring true in one or even some contexts, but can lose relevance in others or even blind us to the very existence of other contexts. And maybe it's not surprising that in rich Western nations like the United States, we tend to create and repeat stories that fit our own culture. Or if they reach beyond, the ability to generalize extends only to other rich nations, and typically not even all those, just the parts we're attending to. For example, we have triumphalist tales about the historical march of productivity and efficiency. And within those tales, stories about how we use machines to replace human and animal labor, the work of muscle and bone. And again, those stories are true enough in some contexts, but even then, the tales often contain vast simplifications. For instance, historians like Anne Norton Green, Joel Tarr, and Clay McShane have shown us that Americans used horses for work far further into the 20th century than simple myths about the transition to automobile use might suggest. But what if we look elsewhere in the world? Well, luckily, we have an ever-growing number of folks in technology studies doing just that, and whole movements dedicated to globalizing the field. It's really great. When we widen the scope of our inquiries, our simple tales of technical progress fall apart, and we're struck by what historian David Edgerton in one of his book titles called the shock of the old. That is, the persistence of old ways of doing things, and along with that, the persistence of purportedly outdated technologies. Just think of the images you may have seen, and the internet is full of them, of a cyclist in some developing country piled to the sky with some bread or straw or pencils he needs to move from point A to point B. People do what they need to do using whatever they have to get shit done. In her current project, The Rickshaw and the Railroad, Human-Powered Transport in the Age of the Machine, Kate McDonald, an associate professor of history at University of California, Santa Barbara, presents us with an interesting example of this phenomenon. Kate is a historian of East Asia and a specialist in Japanese history, and when she looks at countries in that region, she finds that human-powered transportation and delivery continues, well, it continues right up to today. Case in point, our intrepid bicycle delivery guy. And in this and other ways, Kate, as well as her collaborators on a few digital history projects, open vistas for us that enable us to think more deeply and broadly and to tell deeper and broader tales about the relationship between peoples and things. I had a wonderful time talking to Kate. I have deep respect for her, and when I brought her up to a mutual colleague, he said, "Kate is the real deal." In my conversation with her, I could see that she really is, and I think you're going to see it too. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey, get excited! thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Lee, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So I usually don't kind of wonder where to begin with, folks, but you have so many interesting things going on, like both now and in the future and in the past, that I was just like, I don't know. So there was uncertainty for a while. But I thought, why don't we go in through your project, The Rickshaw and the Railroad, Human-Powered Transport in the Age of the Machine? And just to give kind of people a intro, a bit of your vibe and approach to things. So tell us a bit about that project. What are you up to there? What are you looking at? Well, how'd you get into it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. It's nice that when outside people look at my CV, it appears as nutty as the inside of my head feels sometimes. But the the Rickshaw and the Railroad: Human-Powered Transport in the Age of the Machine is a book that's about a couple of things, actually. It's about the persistence of human power in transport technologies over the course of the 20th century. It's about how the rickshaw itself as a occupation and as a device has persisted throughout the 20th century in Japan. It's never stopped being in use. And tying both of these two strands together is this idea of the rickshaw as a sign of both Japan's past and actually humanity's past, that there's some kind of natural trajectory where a society goes from human-powered transport to mechanized and now automated transport. So the book looks at, through this kind of figure of the rickshaw, the book looks at how this idea of human power in transportation has been debated, has been the site of really intense conflict in Japan since the late 19th century all the way through to the present day.
That's really cool. And I hear part of your implicit critique here, maybe, and more explicit in videos I've watched you talk about this stuff, is that when we talk about transportations, especially in probably non-US places and non-European places, it's all about development and modernization and growth and productivity and all these things as like the central analytic. Do I hear that right? That's part of what you're trying to push back on with this angle?
Yeah, I'm trying to push, I guess, so it kind of comes up in a couple of ways. One is the very explicit, societies must have these newfangled transportation devices, but also have them networked and really be emphasizing making transportation more efficient in order to be considered modern and in order to be, developing. And then and that's an idea that's, very closely associated with imperialism and with colonialism. And one of the things I'm doing in the book is showing how these same ideas actually come into play in urban conflicts over urban transportation workers too. So the same ideas that we see, a version of the same ideas that we see in, say, the Japanese in Korea under Japanese colonial rule, where the colonists are arguing that one reason why Koreans shouldn't be allowed to be independent is because they don't understand that transportation should be constantly made more efficient. That same idea is actually deployed to argue for policies that are going to disemploy rickshaw pullers in Osaka as early as 1903. So in the Japanese context, before we see these ideas deployed in the colonies, they're actually being deployed in urban spaces at the hands of social progressives. So that's kind of one version of the development argument. But the other one actually appears in how we write about the history of transportation, both as a kind of these cultural histories of transportation, but also in some sense, histories of transport labor. And that is, as historians, we tend to write about one mode of transport at a time. And so even if we don't ourselves believe in this developmentalist kind of modernization theory trajectory, the literature itself kind of reflects that, because you have this arc of, here's a story that begins and ends with it begins with a rickshaw and it ends with a streetcar. It's like, well, yeah, but it starts up again with the streetcar and then with the automobile and then again with like parcel delivery, right? So we miss the repetition, and that's one of the things that I think is so important about this story.
Yeah, that's cool. It reminds me of David Edgerton, who's a kind of friend and mentor of mine. He points out that even in books I like Ruth Cowan's Social History of Technology textbook, it's we can say as a field we don't kind of buy into these linear tales, but then there's just like these narrative forms I think we fall back on, which is all about the new thing coming in and like, and that wave. And then like, well, what happened to the old thing? Well, it turns out it's still around, and like being used in all these kind of different places. So I think like, right. And so I think, like I see you as kind of like in that same kind of like kind of Edgertonian angle here of like saying like, well, we fall too easily into these kinds of ways of telling stories that we've been handed down to us, even when we're philosophically kind of saying we're opposed to like what that form is doing, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, so first of all, I love David Edgerton and his work. I mean, even back to like 10 eclectic, what's the title of the article? 10 eclectic theses on the historiography of technology or something, right? I keep going back to that. Yeah. Yeah, technology and use. And I think one of the things that, when I think about what am I adding to this critique that he's been so, central in bringing to the fore is let's also think about labor as a kind of use.
Yeah.
So when we talk about technologies and use, we're often talking about how people consume technologies, right? How do they use devices in their everyday lives to accomplish what the transparent purpose of that device is, and that has been a very useful critique. But now I want to say, well, there's also people who are using these devices to make a livelihood, for a livelihood,
right?
And this is a completely different interaction with it's a completely different infrastructure. It's a completely different sense of time. So that's my hope of sort of carrying the Edgertonian torch a little bit, into the next generation. And that's where I think I intersect with your work and, other folks in the field.
Yeah, well, I mean, you didn't know that my next line in my notes here is literally transportation as livelihood. So thank you for setting up. So like, yeah,
I'm a pro at
tell
this.
us a bit about this. You're kind of taking a labor angle on this, right? I mean, you're going in through work and workers. I want to talk to you about this amazing parcel delivery crisis cell phone video at some point. But yeah, I mean, tell us about like the labor angle on this story. How what's it doing for you?
So the labor angle to me is really important because when you start to look at how. Well, wait, let me back up a little bit. One of the things that people have said about rickshaw pullers in Japan and their uprisings, their activism in the early 1900s, is that it's like really hard to figure out what they were trying to accomplish because they're like very intoxicated and it's very there's lots of violence, there's lots of random violence, but all of the documents seem to more or less be written by more elite members of left-wing political parties, right? So what are the rickshaw pullers really any kind of movement in these uprisings or not? And one of the things that I want to do with this book, or at least that I think doing with the work, is pointing out that actually the things that they are saying, to the extent that we actually have a couple documents that shows rickshaw pullers themselves and their ideas, they have a very consistent, meaningful critique of how transportation is as a concept is being talked about. And so what they're saying is, look, this idea that lower fares, expanded service, lower fares, all this stuff is necessarily in the public good, absolutely denies the fact that version of the public good is predicated on our, that abstract public good is predicated on our concrete disemployment, right? And to what extent are we also members of the public? So they actually articulate this notion of transportation as livelihood as an explicit critique against this globally circulating socially progressive notion of transportation improvements as fundamentally in the public good, right, and to the benefit of society. Yeah. And then you can see other like kind of later transport worker movements, and this is very, the jobs are very different. It's a very different structure of wage earning and whatnot. But the critique is very consistent. Like this is our job. We come here to work. We have to make this sustainable. And the public good cannot be defined against what's good for our bodies. So I see this idea of transportation as a livelihood as just as a way of approaching not just transportation technologies, but transportation infrastructure, right, from a really different perspective. Like the use of the infrastructure is very different, which then generates a different set of priorities, a different way of measuring what's good, what's bad. Efficiency is not necessarily good in and of itself, right? Um, and so that's what this like transportation as livelihood idea is doing for me.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And one of the things I saw you say somewhere is that, kind of what we've already said this, but we often cast these kinds of stories as like humans versus technologies or something, because there's like this labor substitution kind of approach we can take to this story. But there's also, I mean, you're saying we need to rethink how we're talking about two things. The first is values, and I think you've already started talking about that. Like, um, what is the value here? And the second thing is we need to rethink how we think about innovation. So play that out for us. Like, how should we think about innovation differently when we're thinking through these stories?
So innovation. So I mean, this is the thing, like, you write about innovation in the era of capitalism is a profitable combination of like technologies and resources and materials. And the question is, how can we think about not just innovation, but change, right? Like historical change in terms that are not measured in profit. So one of the things that rickshaw pullers kind of a conversation that they spark, which then continues way after their movements, is this notion of, well, what is a public good that also includes transportation workers, right? And nobody ever really solves that problem. But even as early as 1903, this very famous Japanese socialist Katayama Sen is saying, look, transportation is incessant, and it's gonna only become more. So if we can't conceptualize a future that includes this body of laborers, we are not going to succeed at coming up with a kind of socially responsible or socially inclusive notion of the public good. So one of the things that then suggests, right, is how do we, what are other kinds, like as you were asking, right, like what are other kinds of innovations that we could be attentive to? And one of the things that's coming out to me as I write this book is just that is forms of labor organizing, right, as themselves being profound innovations in the history of technology, because they are ways that those who are using this infrastructure to make a livelihood, they're ways that these folks have found to actually maintain the possibility of that livelihood itself. If these infrastructures, right, reach this point of intensity and efficiency and extraction that nobody can really sustain themselves in that work, the systems, they fall apart.
No, I think that's a strong argument for kind of broadening our definition of innovation to include forms of social innovation too. And, I mean, there's plenty of good models for doing that. I mean, even Everett Rogers' original kind of diffusion of innovations book is as much about social change as about technological change. So, yeah, I mean, you can think about the spread of union forms and other forms of organizing and how they move around. That sounds like what you're advocating for, right?
Yeah, that's where I'm headed, and this would be a really good point, a really good place for me to pause and say, like, I don't, as much as it's in my best interest to talk about all the novel, cutting edge things I'm doing, I actually think I'm reiterating a story that people have, a point that people have made, in different forms over the past several decades. It's not necessarily new in and of itself, but the fact that we keep coming back to this notion of, we're going to solve all of the kind of horrid working conditions in the transport sector with automation, and that's going to be better for everybody, right? That idea doesn't die. It also is institutionalized. I mean, it has this ideological form, at least in the Japanese context, where, we've got museums that are presenting educational material that draws a very explicit arc of moving from rickshaw to railroad, right? So we teach people to think about technological change and social change in this fashion. And so we have to constantly provide, one of the things I want to do here is like, well, let's provide a different model for how we could think about this technological history that's not a developmentalist narrative.
Yeah, I like it. That's cool. And can you say a bit about so what kind of research you're doing? I mean, you're a historian. Where are you finding these rickshaw stories? Are they in newspapers? Are there archival collections that help you see it? Well, yeah, what are you up to?
Yeah, it's mostly newspapers. So that's where we get documentation of various uprisings, and we get a little bit of a sense of how they worked out. The one that I spent a lot of time on in 1903, that one was actually widely covered in the Osaka newspapers because it happened at exactly the same time, not coincidentally, at exactly the same time as this fifth National Industrial Exhibition, which was, I mean, millions of people going
Mm.
to Osaka to celebrate modernization and this new kind of civilization and enlightenment moment at the cusp of empire. And the rickshaw
Oh
pullers just so
yeah.
they're like nope. They're so mad about city support for a new ferry system. The city is has kind
Uh
of
huh.
rented out, have granted a company a monopoly on the city's rivers to carry folks, and they've mandated that the fares for the ferry are going to be lower than the fares they've already mandated for the rickshaws. And the rickshaw pullers organize, and they get so mad, and they set boats on fire, and it's a big deal. And so that's covered everywhere. That's front
Yeah.
page of Tokyo
Wow.
newspapers, and because the kind of electric streetcar system is being then introduced in Tokyo, and there's this really great piece of reporting from this reporter identifies himself as being just back from Osaka, and he's like, look, but we shouldn't expect stupid uprisings like that here because we're taking this process much more slowly or some reason. So there's this sense that even in 1903, actually
Yeah.
not even in 1903, but actually kind of newly in 1903, this idea that rickshaw pullers are fighting against this inevitable wave of innovation, and that's what
Yeah.
starts to get covered in the newspapers. There's lots of editorials about the kind of just the kind of common sense need for transport change. And then as I move forward into the 1920s and 30s, there's then lots of documents from new labor movements that are organized in support of transport workers. They
Yeah.
oftentimes focus most explicitly on streetcar workers and less so on the more precarious kind of sole proprietor type transport work. And then in the 1960s and 70s, which is something I'm really just starting to dive into, there's newspaper coverage, there's films, there's policy papers, as people try to figure out what is the future of transportation. Because here it's very interesting because we reach the place of maybe ubiquitous transportation where the number of people who are commuting explodes, and all of these transport services were put into place and kind of financed in the 1960s to facilitate this wave of urban and suburbanization, which was represented as the cutting edge in Japan as it was here in the United States. And then all of a sudden, kind of financial support for the rural transport falls out in the early 1970s with a number of different financial crises. And transportation workers are upset because they're being pressured to carry more people and to do so um, with fewer workers and for longer hours, right, and for less money. And the commuters themselves are really mad because they're like crammed in these train cars that are often operating at 200% capacity. Like that was the average capacity, was 200% in 1975. Or that's not an exact figure. Don't quote me on that, but it's up there, right? It's now it's closer to 150%. So and they're not really necessarily air conditioned. It's awful. So you get lots of production about this notion of commuter hell, this idea of transport wars. And so that is where all of a sudden the documentary record gets a little bit bigger than it's a little bit harder to manage, I think. But there's so many interesting things happening that I think speak to the kinds of pressures and concerns that we also feel today.
That's so cool. And I love I mean, that's when Japan, you're saying there's financial crisis, but it's also during its big period of expansion by the 60s and 70s, right? So it's like all caught up with another modernization wave.
Yes.
So all these issues, then they must re-arise.
Yeah. I mean,
Is it?
it's
Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead.
No, it's just, is it kind of something that just keeps coming back up in these moments? Is that kind of part of what you're seeing? Is it like it
Mm-hmm.
reemerges as an issue yet again during particular
Exactly.
kinds of moments? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it comes back again. It comes back. It's kind of a parallel. I think of 1973 as this weird mirror universe parallel to 1903, where in 1903 you had the rickshaw pullers joining in not spontaneous, but relatively, it wasn't planned for a super long time in advance, these huge uprisings that are big news, and they set things on fire, and everybody's like, the rickshaw pullers, they're scary. And then in 1973, you have a series of work to rule slowdowns by the Japan National Railways employees, which are joined by workers in private rail, and also, although this is much less talked about, cargo truckers, taxi drivers, airplane workers. So they have this transportation general strike movement, and commuters are so high, they're so tightly wound, and they're so tired of these constant labor struggles that make it so they can't move their own bodies, that in April of 1973, they flip out and they set train cars on fire. They attack station employees. They set fires in the middle of Ueno Station, right? I know this is not your this is not your dad's image of Japanese commuting, but it was really, it's really wild. You see these pictures, it just looks like riots, and that's how they're talked about. And well, one of the newspapers talks about it as an example of passenger power, fighting back against the insanity of and the tediousness of this incessant labor struggle in transport. But I think of it as this really interesting moment where the commuters are now articulating a kind of third version of transportation. So we have transportation as a measure and maker of history, and this is this idea that we have transportation change, improvement is good it makes social progress. And then we have transport as a livelihood, and that's what the rickshaw pullers have been, and subsequent transport workers have been advocating for. And then we get these commuters who are saying it's also a means of living. Like, we can't actually function without being able to move to our jobs and back, right? And so that also needs to be taken into account. So out of that, you get some very interesting kind of worker commuter coalitions that try to articulate, at the policy level, what would transportation policy that's for the nation as a whole look like versus transportation policy that's for the mass exporters and the big, the large corporations that are really running the country, right?
That's fascinating. So you're a historian of Japan, and you're a historian of technology, but I also specifically, like, in my mind, I just think of you as a historian of mobility and transportation. And so I'm wondering, like, how that happened. Like, you're going through life, you're in grad school. Like, how'd you become a historian of mobility and transportation?
And I feel like I did it, but just like a little bit, just like a second before it was super cool. But maybe that's just my own self-narrative. Well, we all have these stories about how the serendipitous stories about how we end up here. And mine was that I majored in Japanese language in college, and I studied abroad in Japan and did that sort of thing. But I'm putting this on the record. I never took a history course in college. I had enough AP credits to not have to take it. And people told me there were way too much reading. So I was like, cool, I'm going to pass. But I did at the end, when I graduated from college, I went with a friend of mine to go walk the Camino de Santiago, which is this pilgrimage in northern Spain. I think a lot of people have heard of it or done it. It's been around since the 12th century, a really long time. And so we were going to walk it. It's 31 days of walking. We started on day 3. We skipped the Pyrenees. It started right after that, and walked and walked and walked. And you're walking, 20. I want to like 30. A 30-kilometer day would be a really long day, but a lot of days were 20 to 25 kilometers. You're walking for 8 hours. It's literally all you do, and you meet people and you talk, and it's chill. But so you end up in this rhythm, right? And you get, all of a sudden, your world gets really, I mean, I don't want to say small because that's so value laden, but it's a very different sense of your own possibilities and what can be part of your social emotional world when you just have your feet. We got to one of the major cities along on the route, and the route all of a sudden was taking us along highways, and like trucks are barreling past, and it was really not a pleasant walking environment. And so we said, all right, we'll just take a taxi to get into the center of town. Like, it's kind of we're not going to be real pilgrims, but whatever. I don't want to die on the highway. So we did that. And in the span of 20 minutes, we covered an amount of a distance that I knew physically, like viscerally in my body, would have taken us 5 to 6 hours to walk. And I would have had no energy afterwards. And I just remember sitting in that cab going like, oh my God, I understand trains now. Like I understand why people, like why, I mean, even horse-drawn carriages, like all of a sudden being able to move somewhere quickly was like completely earth-shattering, because it wasn't just about getting somewhere quickly. It was like my whole understanding of what I could even do with my day completely changed. So that was my introduction to thinking about mobility as a, not just as something external to our experience of the world, but also just a really important understanding, an important factor in how we understand who we are in the world.
Yeah.
And then I went from there to, trying to talk a little bit about trains, and that ended up in a book about tourism. And now I'm thinking about the kind of stories we tell about mobility, I guess, is one way of thinking about it with this Rickshaw book.
So you had this earlier book, Placing Empire, Travel, and the Social Imagination in Imperial Japan, which was your dissertation, right? And it's your choo-choo train book. Is that what you're saying? Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, that's right. We're called foamers. Yes, where's our choo-choo train book? Yeah.
So
I don't know.
That's it. That's a really interesting book too. And I was thinking when I was reading it this past week, I was thinking I didn't know this literature very well, but I did a field. We had to do 4 fields in grad school, right? And so I did a really interesting field with the environmental historian John Soluri on global environmental history. And I remember when we were doing that field, reading a couple books from the 90s and early 2000s where it was like travel history. So it was like kind of like what travelers were seeing was kind of a genre. I mean, were you kind of writing, was that like a thing going on during that period? Am I right about that?
During the 1920s and 30s?
Or no, like were historians doing was travel history like a thing that was going on when you were doing that work? Is that right?
Well, when I was doing the dissertation work, it was. There's guys like now I'm nervous about getting everybody's name wrong because it's been so long. But guys like John Watson, who have been doing it in the context of British history, and John Urry had a very famous book about travel, kind of the difference between travel and tourism, and then one other European historian whose work I found very enlightening was this guy Rudy Koshar, who was writing about not so much about what the travelers are seeing and the routes that they're taking, but writing about all this infrastructure that emerged in the 20th century to support their travels and to tell them what to see, right? And what is all the work that these guidebooks are doing? What's the function of this industry? And that was the part that I ended up really, really diving into.
No, it's really, I mean, it's a fascinating story. And so what you're looking at, I think for American and European listeners, some of us are aware that Japan was an empire for a while, but I don't think that's not how we think about Japan during the late 19th and early 20th century. And yet what you were looking at was the Japanese as like tourists in their empire, right? So like, how did that kind of open up as a question that you were interested in exploring?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Actually, I teach like history of modern Japan, and I've spent the whole course basically trying to find novel ways to get students to not think about Japan as somehow backwards or behind the United States. And every time I have to sort of ask people, like, we talk about the Meiji Restoration, which happened in 1868. This was the modern revolution. And the students tend to approach it as like, oh, finally, Japan is starting to join the Western nations in its modern development. And I'm like, you guys, somebody tell me what was happening in the United States in the 1860s. It's like, well, the Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. Right. So we have to kind of keep coming back to that. And, there's like Japanese officials who also, Masao Miyoshi has written about this so beautifully. Like the Japanese officials go to the United States in the 1860s and they're like, what is wrong with these people? They are not as cool as they say they are. you know. So okay, so
Yeah.
Japan is like a lot of what's happening in Japan, and this is always so interesting to me as just somebody who lives in the United States. A lot of what's happening in Japan is happening at the same time as it's happening in the United States when it comes to ideas and institutional development, right? It's a parallel story.
Yeah.
I ended up getting into the history of tourism because I was looking for a project to do on trains. Like I had to do a seminar
Okay.
paper, and I was like, I want to do a project on trains. What kind of resources? I
Yeah.
needed primary sources. What can I find? I couldn't at that moment. I wasn't like I could travel in the context of the quarter system.
Uh-huh.
So what's available? And I just discovered stacks and stacks and stacks of Japanese language tourist guidebooks. So guidebooks that were published by the Japanese colonial governments in Korea, in Taiwan, in Manchuria for Japanese travelers to introduce them to these colonized territories. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. It's a really different dynamic when you think about analyzing them. You're going to tell a really different story about Japanese language materials for Japanese travelers than you would, English language
Yeah.
materials for foreign travelers coming to Japan. And so that was how I ended up getting into it. You just couldn't believe how many of these things there were, and it hadn't been written about in English and only very little in Japanese. So I just dove in.
Yeah, that's so cool. And so tell us, just give listeners like a sense of what you found in these guidebooks. Because I think part of your argument, and this is, again, you're working in this kind of broader trend or like thing going on at that moment, is you're looking at what they're telling you to see, in a sense. It's like they're telling you to look with your eyeballs and see the world in a way. So like, tell us a bit about like what things they would say, but also you see this kind of shift from a kind of civilizational colonial moment to like one more focused on valuing pluralism. So yeah, give us an example, but also kind of, give us a sense of the shift.
Mm-hmm. So early on, the first place that their infrastructure really develops to bring Japanese travelers to the empire is actually to get student travelers to go to Port Arthur, and Dalian to Daiden, which is where in 1905 the Japanese military defeated the Russian military in the Russo-Japanese War. And the Russo-Japanese War was a huge deal for Japan. It was like the first time a non-white power had fought a kind of white power, although the place of Russia in the European system was always very precarious, but this is how it's represented. It sparks a huge wave of yellow peril rhetoric because now Japan is so powerful. But in the context of kind of Japanese domestic politics and culture, this is just like a lot of people feel really proud about this moment. A lot of people feel really sad and horrified about this moment because it was also one of the kind of World War Zero is how it's sometimes talked about in terms of the trench warfare and the just attrition as the kind of battle strategy. So there was lots of conflicted feelings about it in Japan. So the colonial government starts inviting students of a more elite level, so the ones who make it into kind of middle and higher school, to come to Port Arthur. And what they are told to do is they are told to feel. Like they are told to imagine themselves on the battle and to imagine the blood of people who are more or less their age in this soil. And they are told to sit there and experience a connection, which is another way of saying manufacture a connection to this land. Not just to the idea of Japan, right? And not just to the people, but to this physical spot. It's very specific on that. And so then you get this kind of, tourism to Manchuria always involves this Russo-Japanese War stuff, which is about this kind of blood connection to the land. But you also see then the colonial government in Taiwan and then also in Korea start to produce their own tourist guidebooks, inviting people to come and see. In this case, you don't have the same, in Korea in particular, you don't have the same. There are battle histories, but they don't work in quite the same way because they're further removed from the immediate moment. But you're invited to see what all of the work that your countrymen are doing. So you see the train stations and the government general buildings and the banks that we've built, and here's this new road that we've made, and look at all the progress that we're making. We're basically going to engineer a new society. And then we will raise up these Koreans who we talk about either as our brothers and our cousins, but also as people who are lower down than us. Like we kind of do a both and approach here. This new infrastructure basically will produce a new body of citizens who are equal to us in development. And this is in Taiwan, it's a little bit different because you have both Taiwanese Chinese residents and also indigenous peoples, and they're treated very differently. But the kind of general arc of what these tourist guidebooks are telling people to see and how they're supposed to interpret that is pretty consistent across the empire. And then this thing happens in the 1910s where a lot of the people who are under colonial rule are very explicit about not liking it anymore, to the extent that they ever liked it. So you have to think about the Wilsonian moment of 1919 as Mandela writes about it. This is happening in various ways in Japan. There was a massive uprising in 1919 in Korea, the March 1st movement. There's lots of other uprisings that are happening on either, kind of a regular basis, if not on such a huge scale in Taiwan. And there's also just constant conflict. It's not like the folks, Koreans who are living under colonialism and people in Taiwan who are living under colonial rule universally were like, this is great, obviously, for the whole period. So there's all these tensions are bubbling up. Right. In the context of a global system that's saying that, we've got the League of Nations saying self-determination is the kind of foundational principle of modern governance. So then we have to have a different approach to empire. We can't just represent empire and the Japanese empire as a force of fundamentally changing the character of colonized people into Japanese people. We can't really do a basic assimilationist rhetoric anymore. And you see the tourist representations also change dramatically to represent this new reality. So we're not talking now about erasing, kind of replacing Koreanness with Japaneseness. We're talking about Japan as the empire that protects the cultural heritage of these colonized places in the face of this Western onslaught of civilization. And so then all of a sudden we've got lots of pictures of local color is what is the phrase that gets used. And one of the things, and here's the kind of link to the Rickshaw on the Railroad book, one of the most common examples of local color are these so-called native modes of transportation. And this is what if you're going to go to Taiwan, you're going to see people pushing human-powered railway carts. If you go to Korea, you're going to look for peddlers carrying A-frame backpacks. If you go to Manchuria, you're going to look for horse-drawn carriages and also for Chinese laborers who are carrying these insanely heavy stacks of soybean cake, right? So these are the kind of fundamental signs of local culture in the 1930s.
That's wonderful. It's a wonderful connection. Oh, I love it. And you also, so not only do you kind of do these fascinating individual research projects like we've been describing so far, but you also do these giant digital projects with other people that do all kinds of things. So I was lucky to be in one of your early ones, I think, which was like a kind of mobility history photo essay thing, and I wrote about like a Fiat recall case in U.S. regulatory history, like the Automobile Safety Agency. But then you have kept going, and now you have this thing called Bodies and Structures 2.0, Deep Mapping Modern East Asian History. So tell us about this. What is this thing? What are you getting up to here?
Well, okay, so that project we did together, PeopleWorks, the labor of transport, which is still hosted on the T2M blog, the Transportation, Traffic, and Mobility History Association blog. That was so cool. That was my first. I was like, I have this idea about transport being really always powered by humans in some way or another, either explicitly as a motive force or implicitly through these other inputs that humans provide, whether they're sensory or it's like road maintenance or it's regulatory infrastructure. And I just wanted to see, does anybody else care about this? And it was so fun to work with you and with everybody else involved in that project, because at some level it was just very validating. Like, okay, people think this is cool. And the feedback was great. Yeah. It's all very self-serving. But and the pictures are really cool. You can, if anybody's looking for it, you can find a link on my UCSB webpage. And I think it's also, if you search for it, it'll come up. Bodies and structures, very different in scope and scale. This is a project where, I mean, just tangentially to any, if there are graduate students out there feeling the kind of imposter syndrome, or just wondering how things happen, should you have more plans? I feel like every good project I've ever done has been the consequence of just some random encounter, whether it's riding in a taxi in the middle of northern Spain, or in this case, I mean, just like that People Works was just an email I sent to Mike Bess about, I don't know, maybe we could think about this thing. And he said yes. And so we kept going. And this Bodies and Structures, I was giving a presentation at the Association for Asian Studies annual meeting on this travel to Port Arthur, and the kind of the feelings, the affective level of affective purpose of that institution, of that process, and also its kind of spatial characteristics. And this guy in the audience asked me a question about space, and I was like, oh, there's somebody else who's thinking about mobility and space and how this is part of how we come to think about ourselves. And it's also very historical, right? There's somebody else in the audience thinking about that in the same way. And it was David Amberis, who's faculty in the history department at North Carolina State University. And he had some money, and so we just got together and put together a syllabus on kind of readings we wanted to do on spatial humanities and spatial thinking. And then after we read that stuff, we thought, well, what would be a really cool project we could do that would put these ideas into play that we have just read about? And we ended up designing this idea of the Bodies and Structures website. So this is a project where we invite, the first 1.0 had 7 contributors, 2.0 has 17. We invite people to pick a primary source in their research language, so Chinese or Vietnamese or Korean or Japanese, or something from East Asia or Southeast Asia, and that has a really interesting spatial story to tell. There's something about how people are thinking about space in this document, or using it, or it's telling us something about how space worked in that period. And we invited them to build a module around that source, tell us why it matters, and then, because we don't want to reintroduce this notion of space as fixed. So either this one person's interpretation as the only way this could be interpreted, or this document in a kind of spatial silo. We wanted to we used this platform called Scalar to build the modules and then interlink them. So they're all there. These documents then existed in the space of the module that author had created, but also existed in this conversation between 7 modules, or then later 17 modules, right, as we got bigger. And then we also built a couple different ways of interacting with the space of the website. So you were always just a little bit disoriented, or maybe I think we went back and forth on how much disorientation was too much, but you're always opting in to an orientation, I think, is maybe the best way to think about it. Because there are, you can situate yourself spatially in a lot of different ways. We develop habits, ways of thinking about space and time and ourselves in them, but that's obviously not the only way to do it. So Doreen Massey said, she's a very famous geographer, and she said, look, space is the simultaneity of stories so far, which is just the greatest invitation to dig in.
Yeah.
And explore the potential, right? The multiplicity, rather than coming up with the one way that it is.
Yeah. I love it. And can you say, so yeah, I'm very intrigued by this spatial history notion. I'm wondering if are there any people you look to, whether back in historiographically or just people you're into, and and do you read a lot of geography? Like, do you find the field of geography helpful? Like, how do you think about spatial history, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, it's I do find the field of human geography, I mean, it's so interesting because, I mean, one of the things that so if you're working, especially not in the context of the United States and Europe, and I mean, this may also be true in that context, but I know it for sure as being this kind of a non-Western scholar, is we're always talking about how frustrating the regional silos are and the regional designation. So, and this is maybe just like a bit of chip on our shoulderness, but you'll get a lot of grumbling about how somebody writing in the US could just kind of throw out a big idea about how history works. And their one example is something that happens, in a neighborhood of New York City in 1912. And that's supposed to be this kind of story of modernity.
Yeah.
And
that's representation.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. But the same you get a kind of a very similar account that's from a neighborhood in Tokyo in 1912. And that's somehow the story of modernity in Japan. Right? So we are constantly running up against this spatial framework, a very 19th century nationalist way of thinking about how history works and how it's divided. And nobody's really found a way around it. It's just all very frustrating. So to me, when I started diving into the literature, the kind of critical human geography literature, it was so exciting because here are people who are like, dude, that is a choice. Here is a menu for how to do it differently. And here's how we think about it in this field. There's no reason why we can't also do that in history. I mean, the two disciplines grew up together. Yeah. They sort of became separate in the 20th century, but lots of shared influences there. So, folks like John Agnew, a geographer who I believe is actually maybe still at UCLA, was very important to me. John Corrigan and David Bodenhammer and Trevor Harris have a book on the spatial humanities. That's very interesting. And then Doreen Massey's work has always been just a huge inspiration.
Cool. I love it. It's funny, I'm back to Edgerton again, but David's now working on this history. It's a global history of production. And but one of the moves he and his grad students make, which fits with the shock of the old approach, is just to like, if you're going to look at production in a region, you just really look at production in the region, not just like what they're doing with whatever cutting edge technology. And then I think it just explodes our desires to like create, I don't know, like treat like Detroit in 1910 as like somehow broadly representative of anything at all, right? It's just like, yeah.
It's, I mean, I feel like that my process, the arc of my career has been like continually learning how little I know and how ill-equipped we are to know things. Like the world is so, humans are so amazing and the world is so rich, and we have, in order to produce knowledge, we really have to use this representational strategy, which does a disservice to so many of the values that we hold dear. And so I'm really, I guess, excited to be part of this moment where we're looking for ways to get more specific, right? Which is not the same thing as getting narrower. It actually, the world really opens up, I think, when you get more specific.
Yeah, totally. And there's not a huge, there's a small community in the Society for the History of Technology of folks working on Asia. But it's also this moment, and, I was just talking about this in a separate issue with your co-editor, Asif Siddiqui, about, I think the most promising thing happening in STS, in the history of technology right now, is the global shift, knowing that, like, we have to enrich our stories of technologies, even if we're going to try to generalize about, like, what is the history of technology and humanity. There's just all these other images that we have to bring in that have not been brought in so far, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I just opened up, I think it's the most recent issue of TNC, and it's a huge, just a special, I'm not sure if it's an official special issue, but it's got like 12 research articles on history of technology in China, and it might be Asia more broadly, but and I was just like, wow. When I published in TNC, it was like, whoa, there's an article that's not about the United States and Europe, and this was 10 years ago, and there's just been such, I was part of the bleeding edge there. But there's been such a shift, and what's so cool about it is like all of these scholars who I've met, who were all working together in this history of technology in East Asian and Asian contexts, everybody is so eager to be part of the history of technology conversation. They don't. I'm also on the
Yes.
editorial board for the Journal of Asian Studies, and like they don't want to publish in JAS. They want to publish in technology and culture, right? They want to be directing this field into its next generation, and it's so fun, and everybody's so generous. Like it's just such a good vibe at those conferences.
This is just like, I don't know. This is literally a random thought, but when you were talking through these primary sources, I was thinking about like, I'm an Americanist, right? So I do write about the U.S. History, but I was like, what primary source would I do in a project like this? And maybe you know this as a historian of transport, but did you know that like horses as modes of transportation are written into the Federalist Papers as in, like which provided an excuse for the U.S. Constitution? Did you know this? It's like
I did not know
one of their
that they appeared in
thinking
the
is
Federalist Papers.
yeah. So it's like the idea is if if you
I'm blaming Lin-Manuel
if
Miranda in my head right now for not telling me about this important element of U.S. history.
Well, I mean, I think that he really missed out here, actually. And so it's like the idea is, when you're building a constitution, if places are like a day or three away by horseback, you're not going to be able to form interest groups to take over. So it's like going to be safe, right? So then, like, I don't know, we lose horse. No, it's not true that we moved to trains and we had interest groups. We had them earlier. It was just a bad thought. But it's just like a really funny example of like how assumptions of transportation get built into all kinds of things around us, right? That we kind of take for granted. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's like we can't actually conceptualize society in any specific sense without thinking about transportation. We can't think about economy without thinking about transportation.
Yes.
But we don't. But we, as people who are working on transportation technologies, we haven't done a very good job of pulling those ideas or kind of connecting the devices that people build and what they say about the devices to these larger political economic ideologies, to these larger kind of social sensibilities, and it's just so interesting to me how they all go together.
Yeah. And then I don't know about, I mean, we could talk about different historiographies, but I feel like in the US case, there was this earlier moment of like the transportation revolution literature, which is definitely 1960s, maybe 1950s, very economics focused. And I've been thinking about this because one of my next historical project is about the Ohio River, and I really want to write a lot about steamboats. Basically, is like I'm going back to that stuff, and transportation and economies and stuff. But I feel like there was this earlier moment, and then it's like anything that it's not cool anymore. It got deeply not cool anymore. So then there was just like this, then it was like they left it alone. I don't know. Do you see something? Are there earlier moments of this in your literatures too? Like, were there ever Japanese folks writing about transport before? Yeah.
Oh, for sure. I mean, so it's both daunting and exciting that there has been, I mean, so it's historiography, and it's also part of the history of thinking about transportation. So it's both primary and secondary at some level. But you have, so the Japan's early modern period, right? The Edo period, people are moving around all the time. There's a network of intercity highways. The daimyo, the lords of the various domains, are required to live in Edo for 6 months out of every 2 years. And they're required to appear with a number of people that is commensurate with their rank to help out both in the kind of governing of the kind of Edo infrastructure with things like firefighting, but also to represent the stature of their lord in the city itself. So you constantly have these huge, movements, political movements of people, and then you also have leisure travel and tourism. All that stuff is also happening in the Edo period. So in the starting in the 1910s, but really ramping up in the 1950s and 60s, you get a ton of Japanese language scholarship that's writing about the history of transportation in the Tokugawa era, in the early modern period, which is, we're talking like 1600 to 1868, and then you also then get, and this is more in the 80s and 90s, scholars like Yamamoto Hirofumi who are writing about technological change and the kind of intersection of technological and social change with the Meiji Restoration, with the introduction of railroads, and then Harada Katsumasa and Aoki Eiichi are also really big names in writing about the cultural history of railroads, both in the kind of urban centers, but then also out in the rural areas. So a ton of writing about transportation as a way of accessing, as a way of describing the kinds of changes that people experienced in these different eras, and ways of describing how social life was organized. At the same time, the beginning of this historiography is absolutely at the time when this notion of transportation as a measure and maker of history is becoming institutionalized as urban policy, as social theory, right? As kind of the fundamental a fundamental element of capitalist political economy. So this historiography both, reflects the kind of ongoing interest of Japanese historians, but is also part of the story of how we have learned to talk about transportation history in this kind of art, in this linear, what William Bill Sewell calls linear, irreversible time, right? And that's, so I'm trying to acknowledge it and then also say, and yet that is a product of history itself, that we're talking about it in this way at all.
Totally. I mean, I would make similar points about this earlier transportation revolution literature, which I think I love and is deep, but it's very linear, very, very caught up in notions of mid-century notions of literary development and growth and all that. Totally. So here, I hesitate to ask this question to someone like you, especially because you've already said, you're on the record saying you just kind of tumble through existence and things happen, which I totally sympathize with. That's just how I tell my story too. I don't know if you've heard, I got into philosophy because of the movie Clueless, because Paul Rudd's character was reading Friedrich Nietzsche by the poolside. That's how I began thinking about anything at all. So this is the way I tell my story too. And you're working on this book, the Rickshaw book, and you have this big, digital project. Is that enough for now, or do you have ideas about what's next?
Yes. I live in the multiverse. I guess the thing that I'm experiencing as I think about what's next is I feel like the Rickshaw and the Railroad book is just going to end up skimming the surface of so many cool stories that I want to tell. If I go ahead and make the point that we could be telling these histories differently, we should be telling them differently, I would like to then go do the work of that.
Yes.
One of the right, let's just walk the walk. One of the frustrating parts of this book that I'm gonna have to just I just admit to here, and then we'll probably have to admit to in longer form in the introduction, is ideally this project would have involved a major ethnographic component. It's not like there aren't there are living transport workers I could be talking to about their feelings, and although we can see them on YouTube and there's blogs and there's comics and there are lots of ways to access those voices. I should be talking to people. But this project really launched, I got my first major grant for it just as the pandemic happened. And so I had plans.
I knew what you were going to say. It is, we're still coming out of that moment.
You see it coming. Yeah, so it's not going to have that, but I do think it really matters. And so I'm going to, I think after this book, I think it's going to be more focused work that's really trying to put into play the ideas that I'm articulating here.
So I had Jennifer Hart, the chair of history, on here at Virginia Tech, and we're very interested. We're talking about the relationship between ethnography and history and other kinds of history. Or other kinds of research, like interviews and stuff. So I think that's a very interesting topic. I think it's good that you see that you've put yourself on the hook. I think that's very honorable of you. I mean, my friend Phil Scranton wrote a book with Patrick Friedensen where he was spelling out the history, where business history should go. and then he saw that he put himself on the hook for doing the work. And then he wrote like 3 books, a history of China and his 2 histories of Hungary, because he's realized he's on the hook. So I think that's very honorable and good of you to do that. Because it's too easy to say what we should be doing than not deliver. Kate, thank you so much. I was prepping today, and a mutual friend said that you are a top shelf historian. I thought I would pass that on, which is certainly how I feel about your work. Yeah, so thank you so much. I knew we would have a bunch of fun, and we did. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Lee. It's great to get to talk with you and work together again.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Ford is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.